The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a conflict that goes back only about 100 years to the end of World War I and is in fact based on land, resources, and competing nationalities. We start our journey at the beginning of the 20th century in the Ottoman Empire. In the area now known as Palestine, which was under Ottoman control at the time, there was a majority Muslim population with Christians, Jews, and other denominations making up the rest, and Jerusalem was about split evenly between the Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of the area was actually relatively peaceful, with these groups coexisting. Then came World War I. The war was a deadlock, with new technologies and military advancements causing a stalemate across Europe. It was in this environment European powers trying to gain support from as many people as possible for their side of the war, including the Zionists. Zionism was a belief that there needed to be established a homeland for the Jewish people for their safety is based on the ideas of Theodor Herzl. The plea for Zionist support resulted in the Balfour Declaration, a British declaration that set forth the motion of establishing a Jewish state in their homeland of Palestine that was issued in 1917. There was an issue though, as the British had previously promised the land to not just the Zionists. They had in fact promised the land to themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement that was between the British and the French to split up the Ottoman Empire and Middle East between themselves, which was sent out in 1916. And they had promised Palestine to the Sheriff of Mecca, Hussein, if he led an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire in hopes of weakening the Central Powers. The British ended up winning World War I and made Palestine a colony until, quote-unquote, the Palestinians were ready to govern themselves. The British instituted a number of policies that destabilized the region over time. These established separate institutions for different religious groups, making cooperation difficult and increasing tensions between them. They also fulfilled part of the Balfour Declaration by facilitating Jewish immigration, and the population of Jews in Palestine increased drastically by a number of over 320,000 between 1920 and 1939. The Jews had a practice of buying land from absentee landlords, evicting the Palestinian farmers, and moving Jews onto the land. This was only one of the many factors combined with the Jewish influx that drastically heightened tensions between the groups in the region. Nationalism was also growing in the Palestinian population, seeing themselves as a nation of people. All of this led to an Arab revolt against the British in 1936, which was brutally crushed with the help of Jewish militias. The British, to ease tensions, restricted Jewish immigration to the region, which upset a large portion of the Jewish population, especially at the time as Jews desperately needed to leave Europe. The British began to see that they were losing control of the Jewish and Palestinian violence in the region. After World War II, which was shockingly peaceful in the Palestinian region, the British handed the issue of Palestine over to the newly created United Nations. The United Nations came up with a partition plan to create an independent Jewish state, Israel, and an independent Palestinian state, Palestine. This plan would spark the first Arab-Israeli war, as many of the Arab states saw this partition plan as more European colonialism, especially as many had just recently gained independence. Israel won the war with Western support and buying World War II military surplus. Israel took 1/3 of land more than the initial partition plan. Jordan occupied the West Bank and Egypt took Gaza. To Israelis, this was the birth of their nation, but to Palestinians, this was the Nakba, or catastrophe, as they became a nation without a state. The conflict was very disastrous, and over 700,000 Palestinians were evicted or fled from Israel, and many Jewish fled or were evicted from surrounding Arab countries. In 1964, Yasser Arafat founded the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, in order to fight for Palestinian sovereignty through diplomatic and terroristic means. The next major conflict we are going to talk about came about in 1967 in the 6 Days War, where Israel, after growing tensions, attacked its neighbors and won, tripling the size of their territory by seizing the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. The UN, in response, passed Resolution 242 in order to try and get everybody involved in the war to recognize the rights of each other to exist, which, obviously, didn't happen. After the seizure of land, Israel began the practice of setting up Israeli settlements in previously Palestinian territory. This movement was internationally condemned as illegal, but nothing was ever done. Then, in 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack with backing from the USSR that turns into the Yom Kippur War. The US, in response, sends over 100,000 tons of supplies to Israel and helps Israel win the war. Then, in 1978, came the first major peace treaty between Israel and another Arab power. Egypt and Israel signed a peace deal known as the Camp David Accords, in which Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. This was hugely controversial in the Arab world, but each Arab state came to make some sort of peace with Israel, whether formal or not, and some of them have or have not held to this day. This marked the ending of the wider Israeli-Arab conflict to the more narrow Israeli-Palestinian conflict.